Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to go my review of WCW's Road Wild 1998. Starting off the evening, we'll go to our first match of the night. It is Ming versus Barbarian. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Ming and the Barbarian, with Ming keeping the pace of the match. Ming then hits a power slam on the Barbarian in the middle of the ring for a near fall. Ming and Barbarian both exchange in the middle of the ring, with Ming applying the Tonga Death Grip on the Barbarian. And your winner of the match is Ming. Hats off to Ming for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Public Enemy versus Alex Wright and Disco Inferno. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Public Enemy and Alex Wright and Inferno, with Public Enemy keeping the pace of the match. Alex Wright then hits Johnny Grunge with a chair shot, but Rocco Rock hits an elbow drop off the stage structure through 3 tables on Disco Inferno, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Public Enemy. Hats off to Public Enemy for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is a triple threat matchup. It is Raven versus Saturn versus Kanyon. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Raven, Saturn, and Kanyon, with Raven keeping the pace of the match. Kanyon and Saturn both exchange in the middle of the ring, with Saturn hitting a leg drop. Saturn then hits a Death Valley driver, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Saturn. Hats off to Saturn for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Rey Mysterio Jr. versus Psychosis. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Mysterio and Psychosis, with Mysterio keeping the pace of the match. Mysterio then hits a Hurricane Rana on Psychosis, and then Rey ultimately hits a Hurricane Rana into a roll-up on Psychosis, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Rey Mysterio Jr. Hats off to Rey Mysterio Jr. for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Chavo Guerrero versus Stevie Ray. This was an awful match. Back and forth matchup between Guerrero and Stevie Ray, with Ray keeping the pace of the match. And Stevie Ray ultimately hits his signature slapjack on Chavo Guerrero, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Stevie Ray. Hats off to Stevie Ray for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Brian Adams versus Steve McMichael. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Adams and McMichael, with McMichael keeping the pace of the match. And McMichael ultimately hits the Tombstone Piledriver on Brian Adams, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Steve McMichael. Hats off to Steve McMichael for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Juventud Guerrera versus Chris Jericho for the WCW Cruiserweight Championship, with special guest referee Dean Malenko. The match itself, great match. Back and forth matchup between Guerrera and Jericho, with Jericho keeping the pace of the match. Jericho then applies a Lion Tamer on Guerrera, but Guerrera breaks the hold. Jericho then hits Guerrera with the championship belt. Malenko was distracted. Guerrero then hits a Hurricane Rana off the top rope with the help from Malenko on Jericho, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match and new WCW Cruiserweight Champion is Juventud Guerrera. Hats off to Juventud Guerrera for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the NWO Invitational Battle Royal. I thought it was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup with everybody involved, with the Giant and Goldberg being the last 2 competitors in this match. Giant hits a chokeslam on Goldberg, but Goldberg gets up, hits a jackknife powerbomb on the Giant in the middle of the ring, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Goldberg. Hats off to Goldberg for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of WCW's Road Wild 1998. It is Diamond Dallas Page teaming up with Jay Leno versus Hollywood Hogan and Eric Bischoff. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with DDP and Leno keeping the pace of the match. Eubanks gets involved in the match by hitting a diamond cutter. Leno then goes for the cover, pins for the 3, And your winners of the match are Diamond Dallas Page and Jay Leno. A couple of things I'm going to say about Road Wild 1998, man, before I get out of here. Solid event. It really is a solid event. And honestly, it was one of those special pay-per-views that WCW put together. I think the concept of Road Wild and what it brought to, the pay-per-view schedule of WCW, I think it was one of those pay-per-views that a lot of fans looked forward to. Usually 9 times out of 10 or 10 times out of 10, the Road Wild pay-per-view was always held at Sturgis. And Sturgis has the big biker rally, so in the crowd there's a lot of people that have Harleys in the crowd that are allowed to bring their Harleys to the arena or where they're having the pay-per-view, which I always thought that was a cool dynamic to the pay-per-view card itself. And they always put on solid cards, man, for Road Wild. I mean, the main events have always been good. And the lineup itself, even for the Road Wild show in 1998, was not that bad. I mean, you got Ming versus Barbarian in the first match of the night. Ming and Barbarian, obviously, probably one of the best tag teams in all of WCW, with the Faces of Fear being managed by Jimmy Hart. And seeing, Ming and Barbarian have a match against each other at this pay-per-view was solid. I mean, Ming's, tongue of death grip, man, was just absolutely insane. Literally insane. And, a lot of people have said Ming is one of the most craziest wrestlers of all time, man. And Ming's had a hell of a career, really. Hell of a career. I mean, you're talking about from the times that, when Ming was in WWE as Haku, and when I believe he was teaming up with Andre the Giant as the Colossal Connection. Solid tag team. Ming's had a hell of a career, as well as the Barbarian. I mean, Barbarian's had some really good matches in WWE. Even, in his early WWE days, he had a tag team. I think he was teaming up with the Warlord. And it was a great tag team. It really was. And this made for a great opening match for Road Wild 1998. Public Enemy versus Alex Wright and Disco Inferno. Again, solid matchup. The one thing I'll take away, though, from that tag team matchup is Public Enemy, man. Rocco Rock and Johnny Grunge, their WCW career, to me, wasn't that great. And I'm not taking anything away from Public Enemy. I think they're a really good tag team. But I think their days were better suited in ECW. I think, obviously, they made a name for themselves working under Paul Heyman in ECW. And, what they brought to WCW, a lot of the matches that Public Enemy had were, like TLC matches. They always brought in that hardcore element into their matches, and rightfully so. I mean, they came from a company that was all about extreme wrestling, hence ECW. But I think, there's certain wrestlers that came over from other promotions that went to WWE or WCW from ECW, and I think some of them just, was better suited for their career, not just financially, but for their career if they stayed with ECW. And I think Public Enemy, despite what happened to ECW and obviously them folding up shop and, they're not, doing shows anymore. But for what it's worth, I think, Public Enemy was one of those teams or one of those wrestlers from ECW that should have stayed with ECW. I think they would have had a really good career, a good send-off for Public Enemy. And, after, unfortunately, ECW folded up shop, then maybe at that point, Public Enemy would have been, better suited with the likes of WWE or WCW. Honestly, for what it's worth, WCW was bought out by Vince McMahon as well. But, when Vince brought in the hardcore dynamic with Mick Foley, I think Public Enemy and what they were doing with the Hardcore Championship at that time would have fit perfectly with WWE. I mean, there's a lot of tag teams back in the day in the, mid to late 90s that brought in that, hardcore dynamic, being the Hardy Boys, Edge and Christian, the Dudleys, that I think Public Enemy really would have fitted in to the tag team division in the, mid to late 90s for WWE rather than WCW, in my honest opinion. So I always took that away from Public Enemy. Really good tag team, but I think WCW really wasn't a good fit for Rocco Rock and Johnny Grunge, in my opinion. With that being said, Raven versus Saturn versus Canyon. I mean, Raven's another one that I think Raven has a great mind for the business. Tremendous mind for the business. But do I think WCW was the ideal place for Raven? No, I don't. And I put that right there with Public Enemy. I think Raven had some really good matches working under Eric Bischoff in WCW. But, again, it's the same thing that I said about Public Enemy, man. If Raven would have stayed with ECW, probably leading up to, anywhere from 95 up to 98. I mean, Raven would have fit into the mold of what WWE was doing at that time, especially with the Attitude Era. it would have been right up Raven's alley. I do. The Attitude Era, brought to me. It's the same thing with ECW. ECW and the Attitude Era for WWE brought in this punk rock, grunge dynamic to professional wrestling. And I think, during the Attitude Era, I think Raven really could have, flourished in the Attitude Era. I think Raven, with just the vignettes you would see that he did in WCW and the Raven's Rules matches, I think it would have been the same thing, if not better, if he was in WWE doing the Raven's Rules matches and going after the Hardcore Championship and, after the WWE Championship, and some of the vignettes and the storylines that he would help create for those matches. I think it would have been absolutely insane. Saturn is one of those guys where, honestly, I think you could have put Saturn anywhere in professional wrestling, and I think Saturn would have fit in, whether it was ECW, WCW, and WWE. Obviously his, stay in ECW, he was a tag team it was Saturn and Cronus, and they made for a hell of a tag team, and they were ECW tag team champions, and they made a hell of a tag team. But after he left ECW, went to WCW, Saturn didn't have really that bad of a career in WCW or WWE. I mean, I think his career, if I'm not mistaken, I think Saturn was a part of the Radical stable in WWE. I think it was Dean Malenko, Chris Benoit, Saturn, and I can't think of the other person. I think it's Dean, Chris Benoit. Oh, no, wow. Chris Benoit, Dean, Eddie Guerrero, and Saturn. I can't believe I forgot Eddie Guerrero. It was a great stable, and I don't know why that, WWE dropped the ball with the Radical stable. I think that stable would have been absolutely awesome in WWE, but unfortunately that stable didn't last long. But Saturn's one of those guys that, he could have adapted to any environment that he was in and, would have had a decent career. Kanyon, and I've mentioned this multiple times about Kanyon as well. Kanyon, rest in peace to Kanyon. But what I will say about Kanyon is just like Saturn. He could have fit in any company in the world and would have been and had a really good career, a good run. And I think the Mortis character, and I will reiterate this multiple times, that the Mortis character, I think, was overlooked. I think what WCW had with the Mortis character with Kanyon, they could have done a hell of a lot more with that character and storylines than what they did with the Mortis character. I mean, the Mortis character literally was born and died with the beef that Mortis had with Glacier. And that was it. I mean, there was nothing else more for the character that they were willing to give Mortis after, the Glacier storyline that Mortis and Glacier had. That was it. But all in all, that triple threat match was solid. Rey Mysterio Jr. versus Psychosis, again, solid matchup. Juventud Guerrero versus Chris Jericho for the Cruiserweight Championship. You guys know how I feel about the Cruiserweight division by now. Cruiserweight division severely underrated for WCW, and the amount of talent that walked through those doors for WCW that were Cruiserweights. I mean, first ballot Hall of Famers, hands down. One of the best Cruiserweight divisions I've ever seen. And then the main event, DDP teaming up with Jay Leno versus Hollywood Hogan and Eric Bischoff. Solid matchup. And like I stated earlier, I mean, the things that WCW did, they weren't all bad. I think one of the things that they benefited from, and one of the things they were really good at, is bringing in these celebrities or these other sports athletes into WCW to have matches. You've seen, Kevin Green come in, Steve Mongo McMichael come in and have a really good career at WCW. I mean, hell, he was even a Four Horsemen. You had other athletes, Dennis Rodman, Karl Malone, when he teamed up with Diamond Dallas Page against Hogan and Dennis Rodman, solid matchup. WCW was always good with bringing eyeballs to the product, especially when it pertained to the celebrities and the athletes that wanted to come over to WCW and have a match. It always put eyeballs on the product, and I think Eric Bischoff and his team at that time, did a hell of a job with doing that, because it got people invested that really weren't invested in the pro wrestling, but just wanted to see what a Karl Malone or a Dennis Rodman would do in a ring, or why are they even in a wrestling ring for WCW. So it always brought in eyeballs to the product that WCW had to offer to the fans. So I thought that was a great business move by WCW and Eric Bischoff and his team at that time. And WCW was always really good at doing those kind of things. But with that being said, just like I do with every single one of these pay-per-views, you guys know by now, I always give these pay-per-views a rating from 1 out of a 10. 1 being the absolute worst, 10 being the absolute best. I'm going to have to give WCW's Road Wild 1998 a solid rating of a 5.5 at best. But This is my review of WCW's Road Wild 1998. I hope you guys are out there staying safe. Be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.